Greetings, everyone. I would like to thank you for joining us today for a joint collaborative effort to bring you information on some of the data repositories that we're definitely interested in sharing with you. And so my name is Lori Sloan, and I'm with the Health Sciences Library and Informatics. And my co-host is Liz Cooper from the University Libraries. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Liz now.
Hey, welcome, everyone. So I'm pleased today to introduce Sebastian Karcher. He's our guest speaker from the QDR, the Qualitative Data Repository. And so let me give a brief introduction of Sebastian. He is the director of the Qualitative Data Repository and the director of the Center for Qualitative and Multi-Method Inquiry, and a research associate professor of political science at Syracuse University. He's got a lot of roles. His main research interests are in research transparency, management and curation of qualitative data, and the interaction of technology and scholarship. He's an active contributor to several scholarly open source projects, including Zotero and the citation style language. And he's taught widely on digital technology and data management. And his work has been published widely across traditional disciplinary lines, including in the social sciences, health sciences, and information science journals. He's also the associate editor of the American Political Science Review, and he's a member of DataCite's technical steering group. His work has been supported by the NSF and the Institute for Museum and Library Services, the Sloan Foundation, and the Mellon Foundation. He's a big mover and shaker in this world. If you know about qualitative data, you know about Sebastian. So we're really happy to have him here today to share information about QDR with our researchers. Sebastian, are you ready?
I am. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Liz. And so the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk for 35 minutes. And so we'll have plenty of time for questions. And if you want to talk about individual projects that you have, you'll also have my contact info and can reach out directly. So some background on QDR. This is our 10th anniversary. And QDR is originally NSF-funded repository and comes out of political science, and that has kind of interesting sociological reasons that I won't get into. What's important is that these days it's really an interdisciplinary repository covering qualitative research in the social sciences and beyond, so especially neighboring disciplines such as education and health sciences that produce a lot of qualitative work increasingly find their way to and then eventually into QDR. Our headquarters are at Syracuse. We work with the iSchool at the University of Washington, Seattle. We have almost 200 projects, and we're going to be at 200 by year's end. And the University of New Mexico is an institutional member, and I'm going to talk a little bit towards the end about what that means. So, the topic of my talk is ethically sharing qualitative data. And one of the reasons I suspect the library is interested in having that, and I suspect many of you are interested in hearing about this, is that the landscape and the expectations are shifting. Starting last year, the NIH requires scientific data and metadata to be managed and shared with potential restrictions and limitations. And they promise to actually monitor compliance with those data management and sharing plans. This is based on federal guidelines, often referred to as the OSTP memo, so a memo that came out of the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy that instructs all agencies, federal agencies awarding grants, to follow similar policies. And NIH went in big, right? They set up a big website, lots of webinars, lots of guidance, bunch of people working on it. Other agencies don't have that type of budget, so we don't see quite as impressive a rollout on the NSF side. say, but they have published what they call the Public Access Strategy 2.0, which in many aspects, though not all, mirrors what NIH is doing, and that will start to go in force for grants submitted in January next year. So probably the next NSF grant that you're thinking about. So what I want to do is I'm want to give you a couple of examples. How does shared qualitative data look like? What is that even? And talk to you a little bit about why we would want to bother. What are the use cases? What are the justifications? And then one of the biggest concerns that we think about and that we keep hearing is around the broad topic of the ethics of sharing data from qualitative research. And so I'll talk a little bit about how to think about that and how to address that in practice, and we'll end up with a couple of words and slides on how to work with us at QDR if you do want to share your data. Let's start with some examples. The bulk of the data we have is interview and focus group transcripts data, almost all of it de-identified. This is from a dissertation project on seed politics in Western Africa. It's fun because we have those individual transcripts. We have focus group transcripts. You see kind of one of those maps that you often get when you draw focus groups on with some sort of spatial context. And then we have actually the interviewees matched to rainfall data, which obviously very important if you think about farming anywhere, in particular in Western Africa. So to get a sense of the context of the interview. So one form of multi-method data that we think about. Completely different, but also multi-method project. This accompanies a political science work on the relationship between public opinion and justifications for Supreme Court decisions. It's based on historical work, mainly in the Supreme Court archives at the Library of Congress, and we have the digital copies of the work that the author used, of the letters mainly and documents from that archive that the author used in the book, together, again, a multi-method work together with original survey work that he collected. Not all qualitative data can be easily or openly shared. This is an example from a collection of mainly interviews and selected field notes from a project by Corey Steimer, a social work researcher at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. She studies still, but particularly this project was about court diversion projects for sex workers. So quite obviously sensitive data. And she spent a lot of time very carefully going through the data and de-identifying it, but still given the remaining sensitivity and risks, the data require a separate application to get access to. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that could look like. So that kind of gives you a sense about some of the data we have. We have a bunch of other kind of quirky things, but again, probably about 60% of what we currently hold are interview and focus group transcripts along the lines of the first and the third project that you saw here. So why should we share qualitative data? And a lot of this is similar to the rationales why we should share any research data, right? It allows others to look more closely in what we do in our research and then build on our work. Secondary analysis of qualitative data is a growing field. It started more in the UK than here, but we're seeing more and more of that in the US too. It's immensely helpful for education. The by far biggest share of reuse that we see is in the classroom. So we have several data sets that are regularly getting used anywhere from your 10-person graduate level seminar to your 200-person intro to qualitative research or even intro to research lecture that you want to use real data to teach students about things like thematic analysis or research methods, more broadly speaking. there is a good amount of research that suggests that more open science that provide access to more material is more impactful science. So it kind of increases the broader impact in NSF terms of the science. And then, you know, these are your carrots. There is the stick that I mentioned in the beginning. Some version of data sharing has become a condition for funding, and to much lesser extent, but to some extent, for publication in journals with more or less strict data sharing policies. Let's give you a couple of examples of how reuse of data could look. So I mentioned secondary analysis of data. We see this a lot by graduate students. This is Corey Steimer's data that I just showed. So restricted access data, very rich, very difficult to obtain. And Marina at West Virginia University used that for her master's thesis. If you look at the time, she got her master's at a particularly difficult time. It would have been very hard to go out and do field work in 2020, 2021. And so that was a particular boon to her. But even without that, we now have another graduate student in sociology using the same data. It's just incredibly difficult to get access to the data. And by relying on secondary data, you can, you know, instead of spending your entire dissertation on that one project, which could be very well spent time, you can do it as maybe part of one chapter because you readily get access to the data. So it allows for different types of research and broader impact of the original research. Another really fun case is this special section of the qualitative report, the journal that Jessica Lester and colleagues put together. So what they did, they gave, I think, 5 or 6 groups of qualitative researchers the same data set from QDR, and then asked them to reanalyze the data. And the idea was both to showcase the different approaches in qualitative data analysis, right? Like, what do they do? How do they differ? What do they bring to the table? But I think the other effect that we see is that it also teases out, this is a small data set. It's 3 long transcripts from 3 different focus groups. And it teases out a lot of different nuances and aspects from the text, depending on how you approach it as a qualitative researcher. So kind of a fascinating methodological exercise. And then, as I mentioned, teaching is really a big chunk of how the data that is shared is getting reused. This from Cardiff Metropolitan in Wales. It's probably the biggest group of students we get overall. They've been doing this for 7-8 years now. So that data set that they typically use for thematic analysis has now been used by more than 1,000 students. All right. So hopefully I've convinced you that there's justification and there is real impact of sharing data. But there are also real concerns with sharing qualitative data in particular. And I'm not going to be able to talk about these at great length, but I do want to kind of flag that these aren't entirely the same concerns that people working with potentially sensitive quantitative things, census or other sensitive survey data have. One issue is that qualitative research is, or at least tends to be, relational. So you build, as you talk to participants, some sort of relationship with them. Sometimes it's a fairly superficial hands-off relationship, right? If you just do a set of semi-structured interviews, you're not going to be that much closer to them than a survey researchers, although still you get to meet them person to person. There's rapport that you build. In other scenarios, you re-interview the same person multiple times. They get to know you as an expert. They build trust in ethnographies. You become part of a community. There's a lot of potential layers that are going on, and what that means for data sharing and what you're sharing and what the data even are can be complex. It also means that our traditional model of consent can be tricky to navigate, right? If you do just semi-structured interviews, this is very straightforward, right? You can send people in, they give you the interview, interview ends, they can still withdraw from the study. They rarely do, but they can. And this is very clear cut. If you do something more participatory, then the question becomes, right, people should know that you're studying X, their environment, their workplace, their etc. But what interactions are covered by informed consent? What does informed consent mean? How is it understood? Can be much more complex in more complex and often more informal environments that make qualitative research potentially very rich. And then there is epistemological commitments, right? If you have a very positivist view of the world, you essentially think there's an objective truth you're trying to get at by doing research. The value of data sharing is very straightforward. If you're seeing research more as a mode of interpretation of socially constructed realities, what exactly is data, and what is data once it gets divorced from your own perspective, put in a repository, can become potentially more complex and a more difficult question. Again, I've written a bunch of these on these topics. There are no simple solutions here, but I want to flag them as existing issues. On the more immediate level, if we think about ethical data sharing, there are some things that you have to do, right? Think about what actually you do and you don't need to collect. Very importantly, ask about the data sharing component if you're planning to share data, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. Be mindful of data security. If you're working in a medical kind of setting, that's often well built into IRBs. If you're doing more field-based research, especially in more volatile contexts, that can become a major concern. Be sure that you de-identify data as promised. Most of the time when we do interviews, we promise confidentiality. Not necessary, not always the case, but I would say probably 95% of qualitative research works with assurances of confidentiality. Think about access controls. Are they appropriate? What levels are appropriate? And then there may be additional consideration depending on who your participant groups are. So particularly vulnerable groups, indigenous groups, etc., require additional thinking about the ethics. So this is fairly straightforward. It's mostly kind of a security-oriented slide, but especially when you're working on sensitive topics, think about what you actually need to collect, right? Focus groups, for example, you often won't recontact participants. You don't necessarily need their real identities or contact information. The advantage is, right, if someone tries to get access to their data, either illegally through hacking, etc., or legally through subpoenas and the legal system, you can't give them or lose what you don't have. So where you don't need it, don't collect identifying information. Similarly, depending on where and with whom you do research, do you need signed consent forms, or is some form of oral consent more appropriate and more secure? IRBs tend to be happy to work with that if you can give them a good justification, and then keep good practices in mind for data security. So, right, if you do plan on recontacting people, store identifying information, re-identification keys completely separate from the transcripts, ideally on a separate server, computer, etc., separate level of encryption, all those sorts of things. If you are going to be in a in the field or in other situations where a security, kind of the physical security of your devices is a challenge, say you're crossing borders that maybe you're a little nervous about, think about strategies for keeping data secure through those interactions. more on informed consent. So this used to be a bigger issue, and we're now seeing kind of a trend towards researchers being more aware. But lots of times, if I look at older consent forms, people just did not talk with participants about what was going to happen with their data outside of the study. There's either nothing in there, or there is very prohibitive language along the lines of only me and members of my research team will have access to the information that you provide to us. We'd think about how you ask people about data sharing, right? So I do research often with researchers. So if I talk to them about their research practices, statements such as I will share transcripts of de-identified transcripts of our interviews in our data repository is a perfectly adequate description of data sharing practices. If you work with people who aren't in academia, that's a fairly meaningless statement because they don't have contexts for like 3 or 4 of the big terms in that sentence. So you want to kind of find adequate language that describes what you're actually planning to with the language, that gives participants a sense of, okay, this is going to happen, allows them to make their own assessment. Is that something that we want or not, right? That is, after all, what informed consent is about, especially if you don't know your participants super well. If you can in some way test their understanding of the consent language, that's a good and ethical idea, right? Maybe follow up after the consent process, not just with, do you have any questions? Because people always say no. But if you're concerned about this, ask a couple of follow-up questions to ensure that they're actually following what you've just consented them into. Don't assume that they have a particular view towards data sharing. So on the one hand, researchers tend to overestimate how skeptical participants are of data sharing, and there is a fair amount of literature that suggests that many participants are quite open to have data shared, especially with other researchers. On the other hand, while studies have shown this for a variety of contexts, this isn't necessarily true for all contexts. So, you've read 3 studies, people like data sharing, doesn't mean that that's true for the population that you're studying. So don't make assumptions, right? Just ask them and be open-minded. I almost always use and very often recommend using opt-in, or sometimes called tiered consent, for studies. That means rather than telling people, I will share your data, I'll consent them into this study, and then I ask, I would like to share information that you provide with other researchers, or something along those lines, whatever the language suggests. If you do research with, again, vulnerable groups and indigenous groups, or particular concern here, individual level consent might not be sufficient. And you may need to think about, okay, how do I consent the community that I'm studying into the study? So often that involves either tribal elders or tribal IRB where that exists, or maybe both, or a tribal meeting where you talk and get the community's buy-in, etc. Typically, if you do it well and work with indigenous groups, you should have the types of relationships that kind of point you towards that sort of thinking in the first place. To give you an example of informed consent, so this is a study that Alicia van der Vos and Jen Miller from Guttmacher did, where I collaborated with them on building a study on informed consent into a study on abortion perceptions that they were conducting. So these are cognitive interviews with cis women in Wisconsin and New Jersey, half of whom have had abortion experience, half of whom didn't. And they did an optional consent to data sharing, and then they followed up in the end with some questions. And so if you want to guess in the chat what percentage of women opted into data sharing given the consent that you see here, I'm always curious what people think. So we get high numbers. We get 80, 100, 70, 97, 95. So people are very optimistic about data sharing. I primed you well. So the numbers are actually in that broad range. About 92% opted into data sharing, although we do, in spite of what I thought was very good language in follow-up questions, they have some concerns about how well everyone understood what data sharing in that context actually implied. And so we have some follow-up research on better understanding that part of the process. The other big question on sharing qualitative research is actually de-identifying this. And I always like to start with this slide, even though it might perhaps be a bit raw right now. So on the left, you have an example of leaving too much context in, right? Individual one for whom Cohen worked at the time began an ultimately successful campaign for president of the United States. That's probably, or not, that's surely too much context for de-identification. And then on the right, you have what you often see in FOIA requests, a very safe mode of de-identification. You just blank out everything. It's entirely safe. It's also entirely useless. And so the art and craft of de-identifying qualitative data is to land somewhere in between these two. And I say art and craft for a reason. This is not an exact science, and there are trade-offs involved. So a lot of it involves judgment calls that you need to make based on your understanding of the data and their context. And a lot of it also involves trade-offs. So the first thing that we always do is we remove direct identifiers, so names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses. That's often pretty costless. The data are just as valuable with those than without it. Don't blank or black things out. It looks ugly. It potentially gives clues about what you're removing. Instead, either use pseudonyms or replace with things like interviewee 1, interviewee 2, interviewee 3. Then talking about indirect identifiers, so contextual information that taken together can identify folks. Broadening categories will often allow you to preserve a fair amount of context while making people much harder to re-identify. So instead of the exact year of birth, give a range that gives people a sense, okay, they were born somewhere between 80 and 90 years ago versus the exact year. Now, by itself, the year doesn't give you much, but with all the other information that is in many qualitative interviews, it might. And then broadening the people this might apply to is helpful. Same with job descriptions, et cetera, et cetera. You do need to read your entire study in context, and you probably need to think about, okay, what do I want to de-identify, and what is so important that I want to keep it in. So for example, if you work in a larger city and you really want the city in because it has a very specific context, you may need to have to remove a bunch of other things that, right, like you work in Philadelphia. It's a big enough city to leave it in, but then you need to be more careful about a couple of other things, because once you get to large hospitals in Philadelphia, there are already fewer. And then, once you have a female surgical chief of surgery in there or something like that, there may be just one left. And vice versa, if you really want to talk about the female chief of surgery, you take out Philadelphia and you hopefully have enough in the US that it's not necessarily re-identifying. Some other things, they're disciplinary, mythological traditions that vary, especially if you do ethnographic work. Pseudonyms are much more common than kind of the more ugly, less conversational replacements. And in some cases, even creating composite characters can be acceptable, although there are also ethnographers that are very skeptical of this practice. But you need to know kind of what's the methodological space that you work in. If you work in a team, you do need to, or you do want to keep a log of what type of stuff gets de-identified and what is it getting called. And obviously you want to be very careful with how you store that log because that's very strongly re-identifying. To save time, it may be worthwhile doing this if you transcribe yourself in that process. If you code, that might be another time where you're reading the data anyway, and you can apply a code for needs to be de-identified. Most of the time we're de-identifying people. Some of the times we're de-identifying locations. If you're doing archaeology, say, burial sites are a typical example, but also communities that may not want to be identified, etc. There are some semi-automated tools that might help you with that. The NIH just did a couple of webinars on it. Johns Hopkins has a whole list on their library's website. Unfortunately, currently the tools aren't all that great yet. So the NLM scrubber, which is one of the common ones, is decently good at finding the safe harbor identifiers. So those, I think it's 19 identifiers that that NIH safe harbor tells you need to be removed to share research data. But especially in the case of qualitative research data, just removing those is often not even close to be sufficient for true de-identification. So if you actually want to ensure confidentiality, you almost always need to go beyond safe harbor in qualitative data. There are some tools under development or under conversation that I think are going to do better. It's always going to involve your judgment in addition to a tool, but I think we are going to get faster with machine help on this. All right, last topic. So you have your data, and I just want to kind of give you a sense, how does this look in a data repository? What you see here is a side-by-side, which would actually be below each other on a screen. So this is one of the studies that we have on palliative care for Parkinson's disease. Sorry, it's not, well, it's palliative care researchers. I don't think it's actually palliative care. So we always have a recommended citation there. So people cite your work appropriately and give you credit when they consult and reuse your data. In addition to get you credit, we provide standardized metrics. So not just how many people cite your work, but also how many people view and download it to give you a rough sense of, what impact does your data have. And the standard that we use for metrics is the same standard used by data repositories around the world. So while those metrics aren't perfect, they are at least comparable between different data sets and different locations. If you publish, we will link your data to the publications that they inform. So there's that back and forth between data and publication. And then, as I mentioned, there's controlled access data. So this is a data set that requires application to access. And you can see here, we always have the documentation files. You don't see any lock here. The documentation files you can just download and look at. So you get a good sense of what the data are about. And if you then want to get to the data, in this case, the transcripts, they are access restricted and you have to apply for access. We try to not put unnecessary restrictions on data, but they're often helpful. The EU has this mantra, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. That's, I think, very helpful to think about this. Our standard QDR license is not an open license in the strict library sense of the word. And what I mean by that is that we do allow people to immediately download and reuse the data that is under our standard license once they've logged in. They also don't have to pay for it ever, but we don't allow people to redistribute the data, and we don't allow commercial use of the data, which would be allowed under kind of what you often hear as a Creative Commons license, CC BY license. They would allow all those things. And a lot of our stakeholders worry that that is too permissive for qualitative data. We want to keep the distribution of those materials that are very rich and very personal, more limited. If you do want to restrict the data further, one option might be to have a more restricted in the sense of a smaller part of the data that's public use so that people can get to very easily, and then the full data set that's restricted. In some cases, embargoes can be helpful. That is in particularly true if there's some reason to think that time will help. So if you work with people in certain political administrations, waiting until the end of their time in office or their administration's time in office might be helpful. If it's very likely that people are going to move out of a certain provision of a state. So one reason, for example, Corey was relatively comfortable sharing the sex worker data is that it's fairly old. It's like 10, 15 years old, and most of the women in question have moved out of sex work since. So that's the way in which timed embargoes can help. People may just want to wait until they're dead. So that's where some of the longer embargoes come in. And then most commonly, we have access by application. So we have people apply to us, and then in a lot of cases, we just check who they are. So we can check, okay, this person has access to the data, and we have them tell us what they need the data for, so that it's not just idle curiosity. In some cases where the data remain identifiable, we ask for IRBs, right? These are still human subjects data if they contain identifiable information. So you need IRB to access the data. In some cases, and that's quite rare because it's a huge bureaucratic hassle, but it provides another level of insurances. We ask them to sign data use agreements, or rather have them signed by their institutional officials. That means that it's not just you as a researcher, but your institution that's putting their name behind compliance with the restrictions placed on that data. ICPSR, the big social science data archive, routinely does this for restricted data. It does significantly delay how quickly people can get to it. So again, we try to avoid it, but it can be helpful if there are significant constraints. In some rare cases, we also have depositors approve access to the data. We try to avoid that whenever that's possible because it's a form of delay, but it also creates, if you want, a breaking point. What do we do when the depositor isn't available to answer that access request? But in some cases, there are contextual factors involved in who should and shouldn't get access to the data, say if it's workplace data, where depositors feel like they need to have that level of control. All right. Last thing. So maybe I've convinced you, or maybe you've been convinced by NIH, or maybe you came here already convinced that you want to deposit your data, and to kind of want to give you a couple of the sense of the couple of the ways in which we can help you. We often do data management consultations that happen as you start your project, or even as you apply for funding for your project. We often review people's data management and sharing plans, send some feedback. We do ask that you budget for QDR if you write us into grant applications over $100,000 roughly, and we do discount what we quote you for that based on UNM's institutional membership. If you have smaller project, intramural funding, dissertations, those types of things, they're typically covered under UNM's membership with QDR. And for all projects, what we then do is we help you with disclosure risk review. We expect you to come in with the identified data. We don't take responsibility for the identification, but we will look over your data and flag things that we are concerned about in terms of disclosure. We'll help you think through, and in most cases, we'll do file renaming and reformatting into appropriate formats for archiving. We'll help you think through, okay, what documentation needs to be there, and we'll make sure that it's then present in the form of metadata, so structured, easy to find for machines, those sorts of things. We'll apply, in most cases, the access controls, and then administer providing access to people who meet the requirements. We have persistent identifiers, so that's the DOIs that you're familiar with from publications. They apply to data just the same way. And because qualitative data often makes sense at the file level, we have DOIs for every single file on QDR, not just for data projects. So if you say you want to cite your own data, you can point to individual files with their DOIs. And arguably, most importantly, we are in the business of long-term preservation. So we try to think about data in terms of decades and not in terms of years when it comes to preservation and persistence. So if someone wants to look at your data in 20 years, we try to make sure that they're still there. And with that, looking forward to any questions you have. And here's all the various ways you can get in touch with me and with QDR.